The night was quiet in Willow Creek, a sleepy little town nestled between rolling hills and endless fields. Tom Harper leaned over the hood of an old pickup truck, his greasy hands twisting a wrench under the faint glow of a flickering garage light. At 29, Tom had spent most of his life fixing things, cars, tractors, even the occasional toaster when Mrs. Jenkins down the road begged him to save her breakfast. He liked the simplicity of it, a problem, a tool, a solution. No complications, no surprises. That's how he kept his world steady, ever since his parents passed and left him the small repair shop on the edge of town. Tonight, though, the air felt different. Thicker, somehow. Tom wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at the clock, 11:47 p.m. He'd promised himself he'd close up by midnight, maybe grab a beer from the fridge and catch the late-night reruns of some old sci-fi show he loved as a kid. The thought made him smile faintly. Spaceships, aliens, heroes saving the galaxy, it was silly, but it always sparked something in him, a little flicker of wonder he didn't let anyone else see. A low rumble broke his thoughts. At first, he figured it was thunder rolling in from the hills. But it grew louder, sharper, until the tools on his workbench rattled and the ground shook beneath his boots. Tom straightened, squinting out the open garage door into the darkness. A streak of light cut across the sky, bright and fast, like a meteor but wrong somehow, too steady, too controlled. His heart thudded as it plummeted, disappearing behind the tree line a mile or so out. A crash followed, loud enough to make his ears ring, and then silence swallowed everything again. Tom stood frozen, his wrench still in hand. Every sensible part of him screamed to stay put, lock the shop, and pretend he hadn't seen a thing. But that flicker of wonder flared up, tugging at him like a kid pulling on a sleeve. He grabbed a flashlight from the bench, slung his worn leather jacket over his shoulders, and headed out into the night. The field behind the shop smelled of damp grass and gasoline as he trudged toward the crash site. His boots sank into the soft earth, and the beam of his flashlight danced across the trees ahead. When he reached the spot, his breath caught. A sleek, silver craft, nothing like any plane or drone he'd ever seen, lay half buried in the dirt, its hull dented and smoking. It was small, maybe the size of a van, with strange markings glowing faintly along its side. Tom circled it slowly, his mind racing. Was this some military experiment? A prank? He didn't have time to decide before a hatch hissed open, and something stumbled out. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, with skin like polished copper and eyes that shimmered green in the dark. Its clothes, or what passed for clothes, were torn, a mix of fabric and shimmering metal clinging to its frame. It staggered forward, clutching a small, glowing box in one hand, and then collapsed a few feet from Tom, its chest heaving. "Hey!" Tom dropped to his knees beside it, his flashlight shaking slightly. "You okay? Can you hear me?" The creature's eyes flicked up, locking onto his. Up close, Tom saw its face, sharp cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and those glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through him. It opened its mouth, and a string of sounds came out, sharp and musical, like nothing Tom had ever heard. He blinked, unsure what to do, then pointed at himself. "Tom. I'm Tom. You." It stared at him, then coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Slowly, it raised a trembling hand and tapped its chest. "Cale," it said, the word rough but clear. "Help, me." Tom's mind spun. An alien. A real, breathing alien was lying in front of him, asking for help. Part of him wanted to run, to call the cops or the army or anyone who'd know what to do. But Cale's eyes held him there, pleading, desperate, and oddly human despite everything else. Tom took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, Cale. Let's get you out of here." He slid an arm under Cale's shoulders, surprised at how light the alien felt, and half carried, half dragged him back toward the shop. Cale clutched the glowing box tighter, muttering words Tom couldn't understand. By the time they reached the garage, Tom's shirt was soaked with sweat, and Cale's breathing had steadied a little. He eased the alien onto an old cot in the corner, then grabbed a bottle of water from his cooler. "Here," Tom said, holding it out. "Drink this. You look like you've been through hell." Cale took the bottle, studying it with a frown before mimicking Tom's earlier gesture and gulping it down. Water dribbled down its chin, and it wiped it away with a shaky hand. "Thank you," Cale said, the words slow but deliberate, like it was testing them out. "You save me." "Not yet, I haven't," Tom muttered, glancing out the garage door. The night was still quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He turned back to Cale. "What's that thing?" He nodded at the box still gripped in Cale's hand. Cale hesitated, then held it up. It was small, no bigger than a phone, with a surface that pulsed with soft blue light. "This key," Cale said. "Freedom. For many. But danger, if they find. They." Tom's stomach tightened. "Who's they?" Before Cale could answer, the sky outside lit up again, this time with dozens of smaller lights, darting and weaving like fireflies on a mission. Tom rushed to the door, his heart pounding as he watched them descend toward the field. Ships, he realized. More of them, sleek and fast, spreading out like a net. Cale struggled to his feet behind him, leaning against the wall for support. "Empire," Cale rasped. "They hunt me. Hunt this." He tapped the box. "We hide. Now." Tom's mind raced. Hide an alien from an alien empire? In his garage? It was insane. But as he looked at Cale, at the fear in those green eyes and the trust already forming there, he felt that flicker of wonder ignite into something stronger. Determination. He didn't know what this key was or why it mattered, but he wasn't about to let Cale face this alone. "All right," Tom said, grabbing a tarp from a shelf. "We'll figure this out. First, we cover that ship out there. Then we get you cleaned up and hidden. You good with that?" Cale nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Good. Tom. Very good." Tom threw the tarp over his shoulder and headed back into the night, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The ships were closer now, their hum filling the air. He didn't know what he'd just signed up for, but one thing was clear, life in Willow Creek was never going to be the same. As he reached the crashed ship and started draping the tarp over it, a shadow passed overhead. Tom ducked low, holding his breath as one of the smaller crafts hovered above the field. Its lights swept the ground, searching, relentless. He pressed himself against the hull, waiting until it moved on. When it finally did, he let out a shaky laugh. "Guess I'm in it now," he whispered to himself. Back in the garage, Cale watched him with those glowing eyes, the box still clutched tight. Tom didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing, he'd protect Cale, and that key, with everything he had. Humanity might not know it yet, but something big was starting, and Tom Harper was right at the heart of it. The sun was barely peeking over the hills when Tom jolted awake, the sound of a distant hum pulling him from a restless sleep. He'd crashed on a chair in the garage after hours of planning with Cale, his back stiff and his mind foggy. The alien sat across from him on the cot, still clutching the glowing box, his coppery skin glinting faintly in the morning light. Cale's green eyes were wide, alert, fixed on the garage door as the hum grew louder. "They're back," Cale said, his voice low but steady. "Empire ships. Closer now." Tom scrambled to his feet, adrenaline kicking in. He peeked through the grimy window beside the door. Sure enough, 3 sleek, black crafts hovered over the field, their lights scanning the ground where Cale's ship lay hidden under the tarp. The tarp had held up through the night, but it wouldn't fool anyone for long, not if they got close. Tom's stomach twisted. He wasn't a soldier or a hero. He was just a guy who fixed engines. But Cale was counting on him, and that was enough to keep him moving. "We can't stay here," Tom said, turning to Cale. "If they find that ship, they'll tear this place apart looking for you. We need to move." Cale nodded, standing with a wince. His injuries from the crash still slowed him down, but there was a fire in his eyes that matched Tom's growing determination. "Where?" Cale asked. "Safe place." Tom thought fast. Willow Creek wasn't big, everyone knew everyone, and strangers stuck out like a sore thumb. Taking Cale into town was a risk, especially with his copper skin and glowing eyes. But there was one spot that might work. "Old Miller's barn," Tom said. "It's been empty since he moved away last year. Out past the creek, hidden by trees. We can hole up there until we figure out our next step." Cale tilted his head, processing the plan. "Good. We go. Now." Tom grabbed a duffel bag from a shelf and stuffed it with essentials: water, a flashlight, some tools, a spare jacket. He hesitated, then tossed in a half-eaten bag of jerky from his desk. "In case you get hungry," he said with a shrug. Cale gave him a curious look but didn't ask. Tom pulled an old baseball cap from a hook and plopped it on Cale's head, tugging it low to shadow his face. "Best we can do for a disguise. Keep your head down." They slipped out the back of the garage, sticking to the shadows as the hum of the ships grew louder. Tom led the way, cutting through the field toward the creek. The air was cool, the grass damp with dew, and every rustle made Tom's heart jump. Cale moved quietly behind him, clutching the box like it was his lifeline. Tom couldn't help but wonder what made it so important, what kind of freedom it promised. But questions could wait. Right now, survival was the priority. The creek came into view, a narrow ribbon of water winding through the trees. Tom motioned for Cale to crouch low as they crossed, using the brush for cover. On the other side, the barn loomed ahead, a weathered, gray structure half swallowed by overgrown vines. It wasn't much, but it was out of sight. Tom pushed the creaky door open, and they slipped inside, dust swirling in the faint light filtering through cracked boards. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and rust. Old farm tools leaned against the walls, and a rusty tractor sat in the corner, abandoned like everything else. Tom dropped the duffel bag and scanned the space. "This'll do," he said. "We can lay low here. Maybe they'll think you're long gone." Cale sank onto a bale of hay, his breathing shallow. "They will not stop," he said. "Empire hunts until they win. Always." Tom frowned, crouching beside him. "Who are they, Cale? What's this empire, and why are they after you?" Cale's eyes flickered, like he was deciding how much to share. After a moment, he held up the box. "This, key to rebellion. Long ago, my people fought Empire. Lost. Many died. Survivors scattered. This," he tapped the box, "holds signal. Call to others. To fight again. Empire wants it gone." Tom stared at the glowing device, his mind racing. A rebellion? Against some galaxy-spanning empire? It sounded like one of those sci-fi shows he loved, only now it was real, and he was smack in the middle of it. "So, you're what, a freedom fighter?" Cale nodded slowly. "Was. Now, fugitive. Last one with key. If they take it, hope dies." Tom let out a low whistle. "No pressure, huh?" He sat back, running a hand through his hair. "All right. We keep it safe. Keep you safe. But we need a plan. Those ships aren't gonna give up easy." Before Cale could respond, a sharp crack split the air outside. Tom bolted to a gap in the barn wall and peered out. One of the black ships had landed near the creek, its hull gleaming in the sunlight. Figures emerged, tall, armored, moving with eerie precision. Their suits shimmered, blending with the surroundings like chameleons. Tom's gut clenched. They're here. How'd they find us so fast? Cale gripped the box tighter. Trackers. In ship. They follow energy. Great, Tom muttered. Should've smashed that thing last night. He scanned the barn, his mechanic's brain kicking into gear. If they couldn't outrun these hunters, maybe they could outsmart them. He grabbed a coil of wire from the duffel and a rusty wrench from the floor. Stay here. I've got an idea. Cale watched, confused, as Tom darted to the tractor. The old machine hadn't run in years, but it still had a battery, and a spark was all he needed. He popped the hood, rigged the wire to the battery terminals, and trailed it across the barn floor to the door. Tripwire, he explained, catching Cale's puzzled look. They step on it, they get a jolt. Won't kill M, but it'll slow M down. Cale's eyes widened. Clever. Human trick. Something like that, Tom grinned. We're good at making do. He wasn't done yet. He dragged an old metal barrel to the back of the barn and tipped it over, spilling out a pile of nails and bolts. If the hunters came through the rear, they'd have a nasty surprise. Then he grabbed a tarp from a corner and tossed it over Cale, hiding him among the hay bales. Stay low. Look like junk. I'll lead M off if I have to. Cale nodded, disappearing under the tarp. Tom took a deep breath and peeked outside again. The hunters were closer now, fanning out across the creek. One raised a device that pulsed with red light, sweeping it over the ground. Tom cursed under his breath. Whatever that was, it wasn't good. The barn door creaked as a shadow fell across it. Tom ducked behind the tractor, his heart pounding. A hunter stepped inside, tall, faceless behind a helmet, its armor shimmering faintly. It moved silently, scanning the room with that red device. Tom held his breath as its foot hovered over the tripwire. Then, crack, the wire sparked, and the hunter jolted, stumbling forward with a hiss of static. Now! Tom shouted, leaping out. He swung the wrench, catching the hunter's helmet with a clang. The figure staggered, but another appeared at the door, raising a sleek weapon. Tom dove behind the tractor as a bolt of energy scorched the wall beside him. Cale burst from the tarp, the box glowing brighter in his hands. He thrust it forward, and a wave of light pulsed out, knocking the second hunter back. Run! Cale yelled, grabbing Tom's arm. They bolted out the back, dodging the scattered nails as more hunters closed in. Tom led Cale through the trees, his lungs burning. Behind them, the barn erupted in flashes of light and sound, sparks from his trap, maybe, or the hunters tearing it apart. He didn't look back. They stumbled into a ditch a half-mile away, collapsing behind a fallen log. Tom panted, his hands shaking, but a wild grin spread across his face. That was insane. We actually got away. Cale clutched the box, his breathing ragged. You fight well, Tom. Brave. Had to, Tom said, wiping dirt from his face. Can't let M win that easy. Cale's eyes softened. Humans, strong. More than I thought. Tom chuckled. You ain't seen nothing yet. But as he spoke, the hum returned, louder, closer. He peeked over the log. A larger ship descended, its shadow swallowing the trees. A voice boomed from it, cold and mechanical, surrender the key or this world burns. Tom's grin faded. They'd escaped the hunters, but the real fight was just beginning. He looked at Cale, the alien's trust anchoring him. Whatever came next, they'd face it together, and Tom would make damn sure humanity showed these Empire jerks what they were made of. The air in the ditch was thick with tension as Tom and Cale crouched behind the fallen log. Above them, the massive Empire ship hovered, its shadow stretching across the trees like a dark hand reaching for them. The mechanical voice echoed again, sharp and final, "Surrender the key, or this world burns." Tom's heart pounded, but his mind was already racing, searching for a way out. He wasn't about to let some alien bullies torch his planet, or take Kale and that glowing box without a fight. Kale's green eyes flickered with fear, but he clutched the key tighter, its blue light pulsing faintly between his fingers. "They mean it, Tom," he whispered. "Empire destroys what it cannot control." "Then we don't let them control anything," Tom said, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. He scanned their surroundings, the ditch, the trees, the rocky creek bed nearby. They couldn't outrun a ship that size, not on foot. But maybe they didn't have to. "We need a stand. Somewhere we can hold them off. By time." Kale tilted his head, his alien mind catching up to Tom's human grit. "Time for what?" "For me to figure out how to hit back," Tom said with a grim smile. "Come on." He grabbed Kale's arm, pulling him deeper into the woods. The hum of the ship followed, its lights sweeping the ground, but the dense trees gave them cover, for now. Tom's legs burned as they ran, his boots slipping on mossy rocks, but he pushed forward, his thoughts spinning. He knew these woods from years of hiking and fixing tractors for farmers out this way. If they could reach the old factory on the edge of town, an abandoned shell of brick and steel, they might have a chance. The factory came into view after a hard sprint, its rusted smokestacks clawing at the sky. The place had shut down a decade ago, left to rot with broken windows and overgrown weeds. Tom kicked open a side door, and they slipped inside, the air cool and musty. Machinery loomed in the shadows, conveyor belts, presses, stacks of scrap metal, all relics of a busier time. To Tom, it wasn't junk. It was potential. "Perfect," he muttered, dropping his duffel bag. "We can work with this." Kale leaned against a wall, catching his breath. "Work how?" "They have weapons. Ships. We have this." He gestured at the dusty factory, doubtful. Tom grinned, already rummaging through the bag for his tools. "You've got your key. I've got my hands. Watch and learn." He got to work, moving fast. The hunters would find them soon, those smaller ships were probably already closing in, but Tom thrived under pressure. He'd fixed engines with minutes to spare for desperate customers, this was just a bigger challenge. He dragged a length of steel pipe from a pile and wedged it against the door, bracing it shut. Then he spotted an old welding torch in a corner, its tank still half full. His grin widened. "Kale, help me move this," he said, pointing to a heavy metal crate. Together, they shoved it toward the center of the room, Tom's muscles straining. He rigged the welding torch to the crate, jury-rigging a crude trigger with wire and a spring from his bag. "Step on this, and it'll blow sparks and flame. Not lethal, but it'll scare the hell out of them." Kale watched, his doubt shifting to curiosity. "You make traps?" "Always have," Tom said, wiping grime from his hands. "Grew up catching raccoons that raided our trash." "Same idea, bigger scale." He didn't stop there. He found a stack of metal sheets and bolted them to a frame, creating a makeshift shield. Then he rigged a pulley system with chains hanging from the ceiling, attaching buckets of bolts and rusty gears. If he pulled the right cord, it'd rain scrap on anyone below. Every piece of junk became a weapon in Tom's hands, his mind buzzing with ideas. Kale followed his lead, hauling materials with surprising strength despite his injuries. As they worked, Kale spoke up. "Why, Tom? Why fight so hard? You could run. Leave me." Tom paused, tightening a bolt. "Because you didn't run when you crashed. You trusted me." "And," he shrugged, a little sheepish. "I've always wondered what's out there. Now I know, and I'm not letting it end like this." Kale's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Humans, strange. Brave. Before Tom could reply, the walls shook. Dust rained from the ceiling as the hum outside turned into a roar. Through a broken window, Tom saw the smaller hunter ships landing, their armored figures spilling out. The big ship loomed above, its lights blinding. They'd been found. Get behind the shield, Tom said, shoving Cale toward the metal wall he'd built. He grabbed a crowbar from the floor and took position by the crate, his pulse racing. When they come, stay low. Let me handle the first wave. The door rattled, then burst open, the steel pipe snapping like a twig. 4 hunters stormed in, their armor shimmering, weapons glowing with eerie light. Tom didn't hesitate. He stomped on the trigger, and the welding torch erupted, spewing a jet of flame and sparks. The hunters flinched, their advance faltering as the fire lit up the dark. Tom swung the crowbar, catching one in the chest. It staggered, its armor denting, and he ducked as another fired an energy bolt that scorched the air above him. He yanked the pulley cord, and the buckets tipped, showering the hunters with bolts and gears. Metal clanged against metal, and one hunter went down, pinned under the debris. Cale sprang into action, the key pulsing brighter in his hands. He thrust it forward, and a wave of energy rippled out, slamming 2 hunters against the wall. Old tech, Cale panted. Forgot I could do that. Nice one. Tom shouted, dodging another blast. He rolled behind the shield, pulling Cale with him. The hunters regrouped, more pouring through the door. Tom's traps had slowed them, but they weren't enough. He needed something bigger. His eyes landed on a massive press machine in the corner, rusted, but its hydraulic arm still looked solid. Cale, can you get that thing running? He asked, pointing. Cale nodded, darting to the machine. His fingers flew over the controls, alien instincts kicking in as he bypassed the dead power grid with a spark from the key. The press groaned to life, its arm creaking upward. Tom grabbed a length of chain and looped it around the arm, then baited the hunters closer, waving his crowbar. Come on, you shiny freaks, he yelled. They charged, and Tom yanked the chain. The press slammed down, crushing 2 hunters flat. Sparks flew, and the floor shook, giving Tom a rush of wild pride. That's human engineering for you. But the victory was short-lived. The big ship outside fired, and a beam of light punched through the roof, blasting the shield apart. Tom and Cale dove for cover as debris rained down. A new figure entered, a towering hunter in darker armor, its presence chilling. It raised a weapon unlike the others, a long barrel crackling with red energy. Cale of the Lost Rebellion, it said, its voice deep and cold. Surrender the key. This human cannot save you. Tom spat dust from his mouth, gripping the crowbar. Want a bet? The commander fired, and Tom shoved Cale aside, the blast grazing his shoulder. Pain seared through him, but he gritted his teeth and charged, swinging the crowbar at the commander's legs. It stumbled, and Cale unleashed another pulse from the key, forcing it back. Together, they retreated deeper into the factory, the hunters closing in. We're out of tricks, Tom gasped, his arm throbbing. What now? Cale's eyes blazed with determination. Not out. Key, can call help. But needs time. Signal weak. Tom nodded, understanding. Then we hold them off. By that time. They backed into a corner, surrounded by machinery and rubble. The commander advanced, its weapon charging again. Tom raised the crowbar, Cale held the key high, and the factory shook as the hunters tightened their net. It was a desperate stand, but Tom felt alive, every ounce of his stubborn, human spirit roaring to life. Outside, the big ship loomed, its shadow a promise of destruction. But inside, Tom and Cale stood together, a mechanic and an alien rebel against an empire. Humanity's potential wasn't just in the key, it was in Tom's unbreakable will. And he'd fight to the last breath to prove it. The factory trembled as Tom and Cale stood back to back, surrounded by the hunters and the towering commander. Dust fell from the cracked ceiling, and the air buzzed with the charge of alien weapons. Tom's shoulder throbbed from the earlier blast, his grip on the crowbar slick with sweat, but he didn't waver. Beside him, Cale held the glowing key high, its blue light flickering as he tried to boost its signal. The commander's red weapon hummed, aimed straight at them, and the big ship outside loomed like a storm waiting to break. "Last chance," the commander said, its voice cutting through the noise. "Give me the key, or this world ends now." Tom spat on the floor, his jaw tight. "You want it? Come take it." The commander fired, and Tom dove, tackling Cale behind a pile of rubble as the red beam scorched the ground where they'd stood. The heat singed his jacket, but he ignored it, scrambling to his feet. "How long does that signal need?" he shouted over the chaos. "Moments," Cale gasped, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the key. "Stronger now, but not enough." "Then we make those moments count," Tom said. He scanned the factory, his mind racing. The press was smashed, the trap spent, but something caught his eye, a tangle of electrical cables dangling from a busted panel on the wall. If he could get to it, maybe he could turn the hunters' tech against them. "Cover me," he told Cale. Cale nodded, thrusting the key forward. Another pulse of energy erupted, shoving the hunters back. Tom sprinted, ducking under a blast that shattered a steel beam overhead. He reached the panel, ripping it open to reveal a mess of wires. His hands moved fast, years of fixing engines guiding him as he twisted the cables together, sparking a live current. He didn't know alien tech, but electricity was universal, and he'd bet anything those shiny suits weren't insulated. "Get ready," he yelled, looping the wires into a crude lasso. He swung it at the nearest hunter, the cable snagging its arm. Sparks flew, and the hunter convulsed, its armor sizzling as it collapsed. Tom whooped, adrenaline surging. "One down." Cale stared, amazed. "You, weaponized junk." "Always," Tom grinned, already prepping another wire. "Keep that signal going." The hunters regrouped, their movements sharper now, closing the gap. The commander raised its weapon again, but Tom flung the second wire, catching its leg. Electricity crackled, and the commander staggered, its shot going wide and blasting a hole in the wall. Cale seized the moment, pouring everything into the key. Its light flared brighter, cutting through the dust like a beacon. "It's working!" Cale shouted. "They hear." "Who hears?" Tom asked, dodging a hunter's lunge. He swung the crowbar, cracking its helmet, but more kept coming. "Rebellion," Cale said, his voice rising with hope. "Allies. They come." Before Tom could process that, the factory shook harder than ever. A deafening roar filled the air, and through the gaping hole in the wall, he saw it, new ships, smaller and ragged, bursting through the sky. They weren't Empire sleek, they were patched together, battle-scarred, and diving straight for the big ship outside. Explosions lit up the night as the newcomers opened fire, driving the Empire craft back. The hunters froze, their heads tilting as if hearing orders. The commander snarled, its armor still smoking from Tom's trick. "This changes nothing," it said, lunging for Cale. Tom didn't think, he just acted. He tackled the commander, slamming it into the rubble. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he held on, pinning it long enough for Cale to dodge. The key's light pulsed once more, and a wave of energy knocked the commander flat. The other hunters hesitated, then retreated, vanishing through the door as the battle raged outside. Tom collapsed beside Cale, breathing hard. "Did we win?" Cale clutched the key, his eyes glowing with relief. "Yes. Signal sent. Rebellion here. Empire runs." Tom laughed, a raw, shaky sound. "Good enough for me." The factory grew quiet as the Empire ship fled, its hunters scattering. Through the broken roof, Tom saw the rebel ships landing, dozens of them, spilling out aliens of every shape and color. Some had scales, others feathers, but they all moved with purpose, securing the area. A tall figure approached the factory, its skin a deep blue, its eyes sharp and kind. "Kale," it said, stepping inside. "You live. And the key?" Kale stood, holding it out. "Safe. Thanks to him." He nodded at Tom. The blue alien studied Tom, then bowed slightly. "I am Vara, leader of this fleet. You are, human." "Tom," he said, brushing dirt off his jacket. "Just a guy who hates bullies." Vara's lips twitched, almost a smile. "More than that, I think. Your world owes you much." Tom shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did what I had to." Kale stepped closer, his voice soft. "No, Tom. You did more. You gave hope." Before Tom could argue, shouts echoed outside. He followed Vara and Kale to the factory door, stepping into a scene he'd never imagined. Rebel aliens worked alongside humans, farmers, shopkeepers, even old Mrs. Jenkins with her toaster, who'd come running when the sky lit up. They didn't flinch at the aliens, they offered water, tools, whatever they had. Tom's chest swelled. This was Willow Creek, messy, stubborn, and tougher than it looked. Vara turned to Kale. "The key's signal calls more. Soon, the galaxy will know Earth stands with us." "Earth?" Tom blinked. "You mean, us? All of us?" "Yes," Kale said, his eyes meeting Tom's. "You proved it. Humans fight. Humans win." Tom looked out at the crowd, his people, now part of something bigger. He'd always wondered what was out there, and now it was here, messy and real. "Guess we're in the game now," he muttered. Days passed, and the rebellion set up camp around Willow Creek. The Empire was gone, for now, but Vara warned they'd return. Tom didn't care. He spent his time fixing rebel ships, his garage a hub of clanking tools and alien chatter. Kale stayed by his side, learning to wield a wrench almost as well as he wielded the key. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Tom sat on a crate outside the garage, a beer in hand. Kale joined him, holding a water bottle he'd grown fond of. The sky was clear, stars winking down, and for once, it felt peaceful. "Why'd you trust me?" Tom asked suddenly, glancing at Kale. "Back then, with the crash. You didn't know me." Kale tilted his head, thoughtful. "I saw, you. Curious. Strong. Not afraid to help. My people lost that, hope. You had it." Tom took a sip, hiding a smile. "Guess I'm not big on giving up." "Good," Kale said. "Galaxy needs that." A rebel ship hummed overhead, patched with Tom's handiwork. Vara approached, her blue skin catching the fading light. "Tom," she said, "we offer you a place. With us. Beyond this world." Tom froze, the beer halfway to his lips. "Leave Earth? See the stars?" That flicker of wonder flared again, brighter than ever. But he looked at the garage, the town, the people who'd stood up when it mattered. "Tempting," he said. "But I think I'm needed here. Earth's just getting started." Vara nodded, respect in her eyes. "Then we'll stay close. Allies." Kale smiled, a real one this time. "I stay too. Learn from you." Tom laughed. "Better watch out, I'll have you fixing tractors in no time." The night deepened, and the three sat together, watching the stars. Earth had changed, Tom had changed it. One man, one alien, one crazy fight, and now humanity was stepping into the galaxy, not with fear, but with grit and heart. The Empire would come back, sure, but Tom knew something they didn't: humans didn't just survive. They thrived. And as he clinked his beer against Cale's water bottle, Tom felt it, a spark of something bigger. The stars weren't just a dream anymore. They were a promise. And he'd be ready.